Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why some groups become incredibly loyal and even willing to make huge sacrifices for each other? What makes one group stick together so tightly while others might feel more loosely connected? Well, this new study from Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim majority country, dives deep into that very question. Imagine you are part of a team, a club, or even a religious group. There are different ways you can feel connected to that group. One is group identification, where you see yourself as part of the group, share its values, and feel a sense of belonging. The other is identity fusion, which is much deeper. It is like a feeling of oneness with the group, where the lines between your personal self and the group blur. You feel like you and the group are one and the same. This sounds really intense, right? Scientists have an idea that this deeper fusion might lead people to do more extreme things for their group, like sacrificing themselves more than just simple identification. But here is the thing. Most of the research on this has been done in Western countries, with people who are mostly Christian. We don't always know if these ideas will hold up in different cultures, especially in a place with such a rich and diverse religious landscape as Indonesia. This study wanted to see if these ideas about identity fusion and group identification apply to Indonesian Muslims. So, the researchers looked at three groups of Indonesian Muslims. First, people who identify as Muslim but aren't part of any specific big organization. Think of them as the general public. Then they looked at members of Nahdlatul Ulama, or NU is a huge organization known for being pretty moderate, promoting a kind of Islam that respects local culture and universal values. They're all about finding a middle path. On the other end of the spectrum, they studied members of the Prosperous and Justice Party, or PKS. PKS is described as an explicitly political and Islamist group. Their members often gather in small, intense study groups to discuss religious teachings and how to apply them. The researchers thought that the PKS group, with their small, intense study groups, might have people who feel more fused with their group because of how close-knit those relationships are. The key thing they were looking for is something called parochialism. This means being really nice and helpful to people in your own group, but potentially being hostile or distrustful towards people outside your group. They wanted to see if identity fusion or group identification predicted this kind of US versus them attitude, especially when it comes to willingness to do extreme things. To figure all this out, they surveyed over 1,000 Indonesian Muslims. They asked people about how much they felt fused with different groups like their family, all Indonesians, all Muslims, and for the PKs and new members, their specific organization. This fusion was measured by asking people to pick an image, wear two circles, one representing themselves and one the group. Overlap to different degrees, more overlap meaning more fusion. They also asked about group identification, which is more like asking how strongly do you identify with this group on a scale. Scroll participants were asked to complete measures of identity fusion using the pictorial identity fusion measure with a 7. Point Response Scale, Swan et al., 2009. This item requests participants to select from 7 images depicting two circles with varying degrees of proximity and overlap. One circle represents the participant and the other. Their group Psy Carousel, they also asked people about things like their religious practices, how fundamentalist their beliefs were, and importantly, how willing they were to fight and die for their group or support actions like exclusively voting for candidates of their own religious background. They wanted to understand what factors led to stronger bonds and potentially more parochial attitudes. Scroll Hypothesis 1. Levels of identity fusion with religious in-group targets will be highest amongst members of the PKS, followed by members new. And lastly, the general public Funti Carousel. So, what did they find? Let's start with their first prediction that PKS members would have the highest identity fusion. For the concept of all Muslims, they were right. PKS members showed significantly higher fusion with the idea of all Muslims compared to both new members and the general public. But interestingly, there was no real difference in fusion between new members and the general public. And when they asked about fusion with their specific organization, like PKS with PKs or new with new, there was no difference between PKs and new members. It seems that for PKs, the broader identity of all Muslims was more potent than their specific party identity in terms of fusion. Scroll Hypothesis 2. Identity fusion scores with religious in-group targets will be higher than group identification scores for PKS members, whereas for new members and the general public group, identification scores will be higher than fusion scores. Carousel now for the big comparison, identity fusion versus group identification. They predicted that fusion would be stronger than identification for the PKS group, but the opposite for new and the general public for the all Muslims target. This prediction held up. PKS members showed higher fusion than identification, while new members and the public showed the reverse. However, when looking at fusion with their specific religious organization, both PKS and new members actually showed higher identification than fusion. This is a bit of a curveball against their initial thoughts. Scroll hypothesis 3. More PKS members than either new members or the general public will select their fused religious groups over their families as being the most important group they belong to and the group they are most willing to protect. Carousel next. They asked people to choose which group was most important to them and which they were most willing to protect. Their family, all Indonesians, all Muslims, or their religious organization. They expected PKS members to pick their religious group over their family. What they found was surprising. Very few PKS members chose their specific organization. However, a lot of PKS members, over 40%, chose all Muslims as their most important group and most willing to protect. This was significantly higher than both new members and the general public. This really highlights the strong global Muslim identity for the PKS, even over family in some cases. For new members and the general public, family was overwhelmingly the most chosen group. Scroll hypothesis 4. Identity fusion with fused target groups will be a stronger predictor than group identification for when participants select a particular in. Group enforced choice measures. Carousel, this is where the study took a really interesting turn. They predicted that identity fusion would be a stronger predictor than group identification for these forced choice decisions. But the results showed the opposite. While both fusion and identification predicted choosing family as most important, identification was actually the stronger predictor, and when looking at choosing all Muslims, both fusion and identification were predictive. But again, identification was the stronger one. Scroll hypothesis 5. Identity fusion with fused target groups will be a stronger predictor than group identification on parochial pro-group outcome measures. Carousel, this was the money question. Would identity fusion, the deeper oneness, be a better predictor of willingness to do extreme things for the group? They tested willingness to fight and die, support for exclusively religious voting, and willingness to demonstrate for the group. And time again, group identification proved to be the stronger predictor, not identity fusion. Scroll in the discussion section. The authors acknowledge the findings are informative and appear to run counter to the existing literature and models that posit identity fusion as a stronger predictor than group identification of extreme pro-group sentiment and behavior. Carousel. This is a really significant finding because it challenges a lot of the existing ideas for a while. The thinking was that the deeper the fusion, the more extreme the actions people would take. But here, in this Indonesian context, group identification seemed to have a stronger grip on predicting these pro-group and sometimes parochial behaviors. Scroll on possible explanation for the difference is due to our analyses including confounds and alternative predictors that they do not include and using different measurement items for fusion and identification. Carousel. So what does this mean? The researchers suggest a few possibilities. One is that maybe this finding is specific to Indonesia or similar cultures. Another idea is that in contexts where daily religious practices and doctrinal study are highly emphasized, which they call a doctrinal mode of religiosity, group identification might simply be more influential than the deeper, imagistic fusion. Even the PKS group's intense study groups, while relational, focus heavily on discussing established dogma. Scroll when there are strong violence condoning norms in a doctrinal system. Identification can lead to higher endorsement of extreme pro-group behaviors, even if in practice such endorsements would be a poorer predictor of actual self. Sacrificial violence compared with fusion. Carousel, they also point out that while fusion might be a better predictor of actual violent behavior in some contexts, expressed willingness to fight and die might be more strongly influenced by identification in cultures with strong norms about religious duty. Even if that identification doesn't necessarily mean actual sacrifice, Scroller results broadly support the reputation of PKs as being a fundamentalist, i.e. high score in fundamentalism, parochial group that promotes identification with a global Muslim identity and you as a more tolerant. Moderate group that promotes identification with a national Indonesian Muslim identity. Carousel, looking at the groups themselves, the study pretty much confirmed what was expected. PKS members scored higher on fundamentalism and showed a strong identification with the global all Muslims identity. U members, on the other hand, were more moderate, and their responses were often similar to the general public, suggesting a stronger identification with a national Indonesian Muslim identity. Importantly, new members had lower levels of fundamentalism and parochial attitudes than the general public, which aligns with the idea that moderate organizations help to reduce extremism. Scroll limitations. We stress that our samples are not representative of the full range of variation of Indonesian Muslims or active Islamic organizations to carousel. Now, it is important to remember the limitations. The researchers themselves point out that their samples weren't perfectly representative of all Indonesian Muslims, and they used single item measures for identification and a visual measure for fusion, which might have influenced the results. These are important things to consider when thinking about the findings. Scroll conclusion. Our findings highlight the importance of testing psychological theories on social identification and group bonding outside of Western contexts, and offer preliminary evidence that processes of group identification may be more salient than identity fusion in Islamic cultural contexts. City, carousel overall. This study is a great example of why we need to look beyond Western cultures to test our psychological theories. It suggests that while identity fusion is a powerful concept in the context of Indonesian Islam, group identification might be a more dominant force in shaping attitudes and willingness to act for the group. It's a reminder that culture and context play a huge role in how we connect with our groups and what we're willing to do for them. What do you all think? Does this resonate with your own experiences of group belonging? Let us know in the comments below, and if you found this interesting, give us a like and subscribe to Rubin's Mind Lab for more deep dives into the fascinating world of psychology. Well, see you in the next video.